Just para que la gente se puede conectar.
Muy bien.
Cuando estén aquí. So, good morning, yep, and on behalf of the Spanish Chamber of Commerce in the UK, thank you very much for joining us for this morning's webinar, which is on the topic of ongoing challenges and opportunities in supply chain and operations, surviving the COVID-19 crisis. We are delighted to be holding this event in collaboration with our patron, IESE Business School, and are joined today by Professor Juan Ribera. Mr. Ribera is a Professor of Operations Management at IESE Business School. He has an MSc and PhD in Industrial Systems and Systems Engineering from the University of Florida, and a doctorate in engineering in industrial engineering from the Polytechnic University of Catalonia. He has previously served as the president of the European Operations Management Association, as the former secretary of the US Operations Management Association, and on several editorial boards of and has published teaching materials and academic research in different journals. He has been active in consultancy in supply chain management and project management and has extensive experience of working with private and public companies in different industries. As a reminder to you all, we want this to be a very interactive session, so please do write in with any comments or questions that you have using the tools that you can see on the bottom of your screen. So there's either the Q&A tool or the chat function, and we'll have time for all of your questions to be answered at the end of the presentation. So I'm now going to hand over to Professor Ribera.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Glad to be here with you this morning. As discussed, the presentation will be on the impact of COVID-19 crisis and in general, how crises like this one impact different supply chain. The purpose of presentation will be first to look at some histories, similarities and differences with previous disruptions in the supply chain. We're going to put these things in perspective in terms of the crisis life cycle, model that goes through the beginning until the end of a crisis. And then we're going to have some Q&A for you to be able to, you're interested in getting deeper in some of the topics that we discussing here. So we start with these similarities and differences. Here in the top of this slide, I'm showing some previous crises, some of them health crises like the Ebola or the AIDS epidemic or the Spanish flu of 1918. And others not healthy, but the financial crisis in 2008 or the Great Depression in 1929. What COVID had as a difference to this is that if you look at some of the epidemics, the Ebola, the AIDS, those may, in the case of the AIDS, it eventually covered a wide part of the world. But at the beginning, it was considered to be something rather local. And in the case of the Ebola, the case of the SARS epidemics or the MERS that we had in terms of viruses in recent years, advanced or developed countries seems to be free of this. It's not been until the COVID that we realize that epidemics are the threat to all countries, not necessarily developing countries, but all countries. In this case, it has covered the entire world. The second thing is that some of these epidemics have passed some time ago. And there is a nice, interesting article in The Economist in 2019, in April, that talk about the collective forgetfulness, which some studies made by researchers in Prague, looking at the towns and villages located along the Vltava basin over 900 years. And they discovered that when there is a flooding and some of the houses suffered and there may be some people dead because of the flooding, the memory lasts for at most one generation. So if we look 2 generations down, the history, the grandchildren of the people who suffered the flooding started building again closer to the river. And that happens in many other situations. And that may explain why we discovered that when we do lessons learned in one of those problems, we discovered that the lessons learned this time are not very different from the lessons learned in previous problems that we have faced. So what I'm going to do now is to look at the crisis life cycle and how to apply that to operation management and supply chain. In particular, I'm going to look at 5 stages in the crisis life cycle, looking first at some of the things that we can do before the crisis strike, which are mainly the prevention part that we see here. Another thing that we can do is to set up the detection mechanism in here so that we know when the crisis is coming, is starting. And then we have some part of recovery, survival, which is just making sure that we don't disappear, recovery, which is getting the damage fixed, damage that the crisis has impacted on us. And finally, we get to the final stage, which is to compete again. And most likely the competition after one of those important crises is going to be different than the way we used to compete in the past. So going to look at each one of these and give you some ideas on some things that you may want later on to get deeper. And I'll be glad if you are interested to provide you some extra readings on some of these things in here. So in particular, let's go to the first one, the prevention. Of course, it's already quite late for that in the COVID crisis. But the first thing we want to know in prevention is that when you have time, it's good to know your supply chain. And knowing the supply chain, I mean not only knowing where the products that you use come from, who is your supplier, and who are your customers. Go beyond the supplier and the customer. Go to the supplier, supplier, and the supplier, supplier, and so on. Most likely, many companies have never had to do this exercise. But if we look a little bit in history, we can figure out some companies, some garment manufacturers that were obliged to look at the extended supply chain when there were some fires in Bangladesh with dead people that were working on the suppliers of some of their suppliers. Similarly, Mattel discovered some years ago that they had to recall a large number of toys because not one of the suppliers, but one of the suppliers had used lead paint for some of these toys. So when these companies suffer one of these crises, they discover that it is not enough to look at their suppliers, but they need to go deeper into the chain because the problem usually comes further down in the part that is not so transparent to us. Supply chains are not chains. In fact, things are much more complex. They are complex networks. They are also quite opaque. We don't see what happens there. So if we really want to get to know our supply chain better, when we don't have a crisis, is a good time to do it because we have the time, we could put the effort into doing that. Besides knowing your supply chain, it's good to understand where your demands come from, because as soon as the crisis strikes, like the coronavirus crisis, we want to figure out what demand do we need to serve from there. So understand where the demands to us comes from and how these demands are going to be affected in case of a pandemic like the one we're here. Once we understand what is the chain and what is the demand, we can look at where the disruptions are likely to occur. So what are the places that are going to hurt us the most? Where are the risks coming from? What can go wrong? What's likely to happen? What are the most vulnerable spots in our chain? For example, imagine that you play the simulation game. Imagine that each one of your suppliers, one at a time, stops delivering you for a period of 1, 2 weeks, 1 month, 2 months, and figure out how impactful this will be to us. And you can try to figure this out when the situation is still good, to figure out, to identify where are the most problematic risk will occur. So we want to measure what is the time to recover from this disruption and what impact this disruption may have to us. We can also want to look at what alternatives do we have? What can we do to mitigate the disruptions that we have identified as likely to occur in our case? And among the different alternatives, we can just draw on our existing inventories. We want to figure out with the usual inventories that we play in our supply chain, how long can we survive a given disruption? Okay? We can try to identify alternative suppliers, maybe in the same region we're buying now, or maybe in closer regions. Is there a supplier close by that can fulfill some of the uh, supplies that we will not be able from our normal suppliers in here? Where are they? Do we want to start contacting them? Do we want to figure out what is their phone number? What is their capacity? How much of the capacity is utilized? Do they have available capacity on short demand? Can they move into a third shift? Can they do overtime if necessary? So look at this. And when we do that, we can discover that we may have some of our bottlenecks, some of these hot spots within our own control. Some of the factories that belong to our company may be some of these hot spots. And it's a good time to discuss whether we want to maintain them like they are, or we want to have at least 2 factories located in 2 different world regions, so that if one of them is hit by one disruption, you can still count on the second one. And also it's time to look at alternative material or alternative production processes. For example, this is something that has occurred during the COVID crisis in some of our hospitals. Some of the hospitals, they have been lucky when they could go to use some of the old respirators. That way they were no longer in production, but they were still well maintained and they were there just in case. Well, they could incorporate those respirators and they have been able to get some extra intensive care unit beds. Okay, these are alternative equipment that we could use for that. And an exercise that we can do anytime is the supply chain stress test. You can talk, when we hear a stress test, we heard a lot about that in the financial crisis in 2008, when all banks, at least in the European region, were subject to this stress test. The idea here is to see how those banks were prepared to survive a hypothetical disruption in the economy of different magnitudes. This is done also very often in healthcare. If you have a cardiac problem, your doctor will put some cables on your chest and see how your heart reacts to different disruption, like when you are asked to walk or to run, we're asked to cycle. And it's very common done in engineering to test the strength of materials and how much stress we can put in one material before it breaks. Okay? Similarly, a supply chain is made up of separate components that have to work together. And we want to figure out which one is going to be the first one to break. And we can play that with the safety of our model before anything happens. This is what we want to do during the prevention stage. And there are more and more tools available for us to do these stress tests. The second part is the detection. When do we, or how do we figure out that something is happening, that it is worth investigating the problems that may be occurring somewhere in our supply chain? The first step is the capacity to monitor. I mentioned before, supply chains are much more opaque than we imagine. We are used as individuals to order something from Amazon or to order something on e-commerce and to be able to go to our own page on the Amazon and track our orders. And we can figure out if the order has already left my supplier or the original supplier in the Canton area, if it's already arrived in my country, if it's going to be distributed today, where it is. So it's very easy for us to track it. Real supply chains are not that transparent because they are generally very fragmented and they are controlled in a silo way by people whose objective is not to make the supply chain transparent. Okay, the production side, the freight forwarders, the ocean shippers, they are all very jealous of their data because by controlling the data is how they can add value to you in letting you know where things are or solving problems when they occur before you even notice that the problems are there. So they are very opaque, they are very fragmented. Nobody has an overall view of the whole chain. Fortunately, we are getting a lot of sensors available. We're getting in place the Internet of Things, where it's going to be easy to put at least in every container and probably in each one of the packages that we ship, the equivalent of a GPS and a mobile phone or a meter to be able to track where things are and be able to see online if something else stops in the flow from the supplier to me. Technology is there. We just need the will to implement these technologies in our supply chains. It is useful also in the detection to realize that there are some things that we know very well and some things that we may not know so well. This framework was used by Donald Rumsfeld in a rather jokingly way in 2002 in asking a question by one of the journalists about the Iraq war. And what he mentioned is there are some things we know. There are some things that we know that we don't know, but there are also some things that we don't know that we don't know, which is actually what I have put here. We know that we know that we don't know, and we don't know that we don't know. Here. But also we have the things that we know, of course, those are the obvious ones. We'll come back to those in a minute. Of the other three, the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns, the most complicated ones are obviously the unknown unknowns, because if there is something that we don't know, it's very difficult to try to figure it out. For the things that are in the known unknown, things that we know that we don't know, well, we can find out. If I know that I don't know what is the weather in London now, I can go and find it out. But if I don't know that something is happening in Buenos Aires, I have no spark that is starting my fire of willingness to learn that. So how do we move from the unknown unknowns to the known unknowns? To move from this quadrant to this quadrant, we need to explore outside of our usual areas. We need to go and ask people who may have had some experience that we have not had in the past with some of the problems that we may face. And they say, well, you never experienced that, but there was one time during the tsunami in Japan in which we were for 2 months without supplies. And this happened to the automotive industry because that it was badly hit during the tsunami. It didn't happen in the pharma industry at the time, but now it may happen because of, and of course now you learn from other areas that are not in your usual body of knowledge in here. So figure out where are the things that you know, what are the things that you don't know, and do some things to get to know, at least to get to know that you don't know them, and get to know who can tell you or who can enlighten you if you need to know. The detection of the signals. It is no secret that the earlier we can detect that something is happening, the earlier we're going to start finding a solution, and the more time we'll have to apply that solution. Here there is one case study that we usually discuss in business schools, which is two companies that were competing at the time. It was Nokia on one side in Finland and Ericsson in Sweden. And the two companies were using some chips from the same supplier, which was Philips. And Philips was manufacturing those chips that went into the mobile phones in a plant in close to Albuquerque in New Mexico in the US. This plant suffered a small fire, and Philips people, they sent information to both Nokia and Ericsson that there's been a small fire in the plant, which will probably have an impact of getting some delays in the products, delays of about 1 week. Both Ericsson and Nokia could survive with these delays, but they reacted differently. In the case of Nokia, they look at the signal and they said, well, a fire is never a small problem. A fire is a big problem. So what they did was to be in contact continuously with Philips and get information from Philips on what was the situation, how was the situation evolving. And eventually they sent some people, a couple of people from Nokia to Philips. And that was all within the first week of the fire. At the time the people arrived to Albuquerque, they discovered that the fire has been in a small part of the plant, but that the smoke had actually contaminated the whole plant. It would take much longer than a week to fix it. Obviously, since these guys were already in Albuquerque, they could start finding alternative solutions. Okay, they identified within the same Philips network another plant in Asia that could actually manufacture the same chips, and they started moving some of the production from Albuquerque to Mexico. They also identify alternative suppliers that then make chips that could be used with a small change in the software, that it was possible. So they started reacting to mitigate the impact of the fire. While the Nokia people were doing that with Philips, the Ericsson people were still wondering why the shipment that was supposed to arrive in a week has not yet arrived, and it's been 10 days. By the time Ericsson discovered that the problem was bigger than they had originally imagined, Nokia had blocked a lot of the alternative supplier. And that meant probably a small impact in the volume of the chips, something less than $1 million, but a much larger impact in the lost sale for Ericsson, which had big problems to survive during that year. So detection of the signals, and have someone that is able to separate the signal from the noise to detect that something unusual is happening and react earlier is important. In the current coronavirus, we had this thing. We had some signals coming from China already at the end of the year, arriving some signals to the WHO that there was a new virus detected. In the middle of January, there were some signals that China was being impacted by that. By the beginning of February, some companies started notifying that sales in China during this quarter were going to suffer because of this. But I remember at the beginning of March, many European countries, business were as usual. Actually, in the beginning of March, we were having some business as usual. Football fans were traveling from one country to another. We filled the stadiums. We were having demonstrations, even though we had been given, there were signals 2 months before that. Right? So we have not been as agile in moving the information as necessary. Sorry, I had moved here. The survival. We arrived to the survival strategy. The crisis has already hit us. Why it takes so long to discover that we have a problem? Well, people have a tendency to be biased. In front of a risk, either people believe that it's not going to be important, they downplay the risk, or other people overemphasize them. We have also some confirmation bias. We tend to read newspapers that confirm our beliefs and not to read the ones that question them. People in companies tend to be safer if they don't speak up, called the crisis of silence. So if the boss says that everything is going to be fine, why should I just go and tell him that I don't believe so? He's the boss anyway. Some years ago in 2007 with the H5N1 bird flu, Secretary of State Michael Leavitt in the US said that everything you do in advance of a pandemic seems alarmist, and everything you do after it is inadequate. In some sense, it's like playing a blackjack. Okay, either you stop too short or you do too much in here. We get to the survival. In survival, we need to first update the supply chain information. All what we did in the preparedness, if we know already what the supply chain looks like, etc., we are most likely to be able to update the information easily. It is not a good time to find alternatives when the crisis is there. Okay? This is a book published some years ago, says, dig your well before you are thirsty. What that tells us is finding new friends, finding new suppliers in times of crisis is not a good time to start finding the suppliers. You will not have the time to do the due diligence, to check their capacity, to check the quality. But anyway, if we don't do it now, it will be even later. So we need to do that. We need to find the risk and the alternative. We want to identify What are the best use of our scarce resources? And when we look at the scarce resources in here, we talk about materials. If the supplier is not going to deliver all the materials we order, how are we going to use these materials? Are there any substitutes for the materials that we will not get? Which products are going to get these materials? How do we decide on that? What equipment? What happens if we don't get supplies for some equipment or spare parts for the equipment? Which products are going to use the available equipment and which priority? People. We need to ensure the welfare of our people. During the coronavirus crisis, one of the problems of hospitals was, what if our staff get sick? So, of course, the first line of prevention was to make sure that the staff did not get sick, and the staff were there to take care of the rest of the population. So take care of your population, take care of your employees, keep the know-how that we are able to recover, reassign people if necessary, and customers. If we cannot serve all the customers, whom do we serve? Do we serve the ones that give us the most margin? Well, if this is our objective, we can start opening some bidding to see how much they are willing to pay for the scarce product. Well, that's not going to work very well in the future. This profiteering attitude will probably backfire. So how do we decide on that? How do we understand the criticality of the products that our customers are making with our components? And maybe we want to rank things based on that. So the best use of the resources. And finally, an interesting thing is the governance of the supply chain during the time of the crisis. It is known, or there is a natural tendency when supply chains hit disruption to go to a centralization strategy. Actually, some leaders are made by becoming strong leaders and managing organizations through crisis. Well, it makes sense to have some sort of centralization. But remember that if you are just called the coronavirus champion overnight, you are not becoming smarter overnight, and you don't have better knowledge overnight. So you're probably still, if you are in charge of the whole chain, you still will have to depend on some people in the network, who are the people who know what was happening and the people who have the connections. If you have some suppliers in China, suppliers in China will probably have developed some one-shi with your purchasing people wherever they are located. If you have an office in China, probably the supplier in China has this working relationship with your purchaser in China. If the crisis strikes your company, you decide to centralize all the purchases from your office in Munich, and you decide to start contacting your suppliers in China directly, those guys don't know you. They probably will pay you less attention, even if you are higher in the hierarchy, than they pay to the local guy with whom they have had business for the last 20 years. So be careful with the too much centralization. You want to centralize the information, but you still want to use all the available talent that exists in the network here. Finally, we get to recovery. How do we recover from the damage that the disruption has done to us? The first thing, we need to understand, where are we going back to? What is now called the new normal, which has been used for both in China with Xi Jinping, go to the presidency, says China is going to be different. It will be normal, but will be a new normal, different from the previous one. We have used it in the past also for different crises in there. So what is the new normal? How do the new normal looks like? And the problem with the new normal is that some of the things that we had in the what we know category may no longer be true. Things that we expected to be there, they may have been damaged by the disruption, by the crisis, and we cannot count on them. So we need to realize, what are the things that we believe to be true that they are no longer true. Second, we need to figure out what are the plans for the recovery, how we are going to scale up from the situation we are now back to what we need to do. how the future is going to look like. And in here, it will be difficult to forecast how the future will look like. So it is a good time to start looking for different scenarios, identify some dimensions that may define the future, and don't try to guess what the future will look like, but try to imagine if the future look like either one of these scenarios, what do we need to do? And if we find something that is common to all these scenarios, just do it. Plan for the recovery, whatever the future may look like. If this is going to be good for different scenarios, this is what I want to do. So try to simplify processes, try to get things faster, try to eliminate the red tape, eliminate the bureaucracy, look at the decisions you take from the different perspective, from the perspective of the customer, the employee, etc., and try to adopt an agile mindset. Because you don't know what the new normality will be like, you may want to be agile to learn, to explore what this normality may be, and be quick in changing your hypothesis in there. You may have to question some previous decisions. For example, some of the things that we decided in the past to make or buy. How do we decide make or buy? We usually look at two dimensions. We look at how easy it is to find what we are looking for and how core what we are looking for is to our company. If the things are it is very easy, sorry, not this one, wait a minute. If we are in things that are very easy to find here, and they are not core, so no, yes. Very easy to find, yes. Very easy to find, and they are not core, they are here. The question is, subcontract them, buy them. They are widely available in the market. It is not core to us to buy it. The ones that are here, they are core, or they are not widely available. Those are the things we want to keep within the company. The question is, what happens to these other quadrants in here? And how the things have moved. Maybe some things that were widely available in the market before, now if there's been a tsunami in Japan, they are no longer widely available. So maybe our decision, something that we decided to buy instead of make, needs to be changed. Maybe we need to find another supplier, what is now known as the China plus one strategy. Keep the one effective supplier in China, but find an alternative supplier closer on to fill it. That's maybe difficult in some industries, but it may be absolutely necessary in other industries. Revisit your operational processes. Look at the process you have in place and try to identify which ones still add value now and which ones they no longer add value. Everything that we did probably needs to be questioned. Do we still want to do this? We want to simplify the processes. And finally, we get to the new situation. And here it's interesting to remember that every crisis is an opportunity. Actually, one of the things that most people found during the crisis, especially I've been interviewing a lot of hospital managers during this crisis, is that they have accelerated the situation. Okay, so the crisis has accelerated things. Things that would have taken a hospital 1 year to get done, they were done in less than a week. People align their efforts in front of a crisis, not in the same way that they do under normal circumstances. So because a crisis eliminates these boundary conditions, provides innovation accelerators, a good opportunity to do things that would have otherwise taken a long time to do, or it would have been impossible to do. So look for these opportunities. And when a crisis comes, never let a crisis go to waste. Use it for all the things that the crisis allows us to do. Change the things that you wanted to change during this. Discover what we have learned during the crisis. What are the lessons learned? And make sure that you embed these lessons into the processes of the future. Avoid this collective forgetfulness that was mentioned. If the things are embedded into the processes, people will follow them. If we just have them in the back of their minds, the next time a crisis hits, we'll have to take care of that. Chances are we'll not remember it or maybe we will no longer be in the position to make decisions at that time. And finally, when you look at how to compete in the new normal, we need to figure out what the new normal is. Maybe the new normal is going to compete with empty stadiums. Maybe we'll have to play with teams that will allow for 5 changes in the team. That will be different. It's different when we are allowed to rotate players than we are not allowed to rotate players. Well, what is going to change in the way we compete? We need to go back to the all order qualifiers and other winners. Other qualifiers, the things that everybody is able to provide. Other winners are the things that our company does better than the others. What is this? Are still the same things that we did before, or there are some new order winners? Do the SWOT analysis, weakness, opportunities, threats. And how do we need to change our supply chain to help the company compete? Maybe in the past, cost was a very strong competitive dimension for us. Maybe now it is lead time. We want to be able to deliver faster. Well, we need to change the way we manage the supply chain. So we're going to redesign the supply chain now for speed rather than low cost. Well, if this is the new way to compete, this is what we should do. How are we going to compete in the new supply chain? Final word in this is every crisis creates opportunities. What will be the opportunities for your company in here and how we can leverage them? We need to identify them and leverage them. This is what I had in terms of the time given for the presentation. And it is now time to enter some 15, 20 minutes of Q&A. It will be, I can extend it, but it will be up to you, the questions that you may want to ask. I have asked Hannah to help us with the questioning and checking your questions and editing them before they pass them to me. So Hannah, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Hello, thank you so much, Juan. That was really interesting. So yeah, please, as I said before, everyone, please write in with your questions using the tools I said before, the chat and the Q&A, which you can see on the bottom of your screens there. Okay, well then one so we have to kick us off is, some countries have said that the COVID pandemic has shown the problems with globalization and proposed strategies to make their countries less dependent on global trade. Do you think that COVID-19 is the beginning of the end of globalization?
It may look like that, in the sense that when you are in Spain, where I was, and you look for masks and you cannot get enough masks if you're in a hospital and you need them for the survival of the people, you start wondering, why did we allow all the mask manufacturers to go to China? And China to provide the global market for that. I've heard some people, some presidents of companies in France say we're going to build our whole supply chain within the country, not to have to depend on other regions, other countries. Well, if you are in France and you decide to move all your supply chain into France, definitely if there is a coronavirus crisis in Wuhan, you will not be affected. But what will happen if the coronavirus happens to be in France and not in China next time? Okay? So that's probably going to reduce the level of globalization. We'll probably look for what I was mentioning before, the China +1 strategy. So keep this very efficient supplier in China, but have another supplier in another completely different region, isolated region of the world that can complement the first supplier. Sometimes this is going to be difficult. Okay, China has done very well in creating clusters that are very efficient to manufacture in different parts. There are some regions in China that make, I think it was more than 75% of all the toothbrushes in the world are made there. It's not because they have the factory for toothbrushes, because the factory for toothbrushes plus all the suppliers that you need to make toothbrushes and all the knowledge about toothbrush making that you need in there. And this is very difficult to replicate in other countries, especially if you are not going to get the same volume that China gets in there. Okay? It's not going to be easy. Probably we will keep the global suppliers that we have now, but we are going to find probably an alternative for each one of them that we can try to. But globalization will not disappear if we have been buying from faraway countries at cheap prices with quick reaction times. It's for something, is that these countries have developed the clusters that are very, very efficient to make what they make. And it's not so easy to replicate these efficiencies in each one of the other countries. It may be efficient to replicate some of these things, maybe in the American continent, and to have another big supplier in the American continent there. So it will not be global, it will be half global, but still globalization is there to stay, I believe.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, another question that we've had that's come in is, so we've heard managers blaming the lean trends in the last decades for the shortages that we have suffered in different countries, and proposed to move from just in time to just in case and maintain enough levels of inventories to cover situations like the pandemic that we've suffered. Do you think that lean is to blame?
Well, probably it's not lean to blame, it's the interpretation of lean. I think if we go back to the origins of lean, when we companies and professors in the Western world at the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s, we started traveling to Japan to learn these new tricks of the what was called just in time, or at the time, and then evolve into lean. The basics are that we actually started from a just in case situation. We had a lot of things in our warehouses. We had a lot of equipment that was there just in case one day we'll need it. And the evolution was to identify what is the role that those inventories play, what is the role that the equipment play, and of course make sure that if this inventory has a role, it needs to stay there, but eliminate what we call waste. And sometimes what we had is to confuse the resilience with waste. It's good to be resilient, it's good to have some inventories, prepare for some events. But now, there's a limit to that. Okay? We cannot have in each one of our homes everything that we are going to need if we are going to be locked down for a couple of months. Impossible. Doesn't make sense. Most of the things would be obsolete, would expire before we are going to use them. Okay? So we cannot keep that. It would be very costly. Similarly, a factory may not have another factory next to it with all the equipment prepared and all the inventory ready, just in case they need to turn it on if a crisis occurs. What we need to do is to identify what are the risks, the way I was doing, what are the problems that the supply chain, what are the hottest spots in the supply chain, and prepare for those. And when you prepare inventory for this is not waste. This is creating resilience in the supply chain. Lean has never been about eliminating resilience. It has been eliminating waste. Okay, and the things that we know why they are there and why we want to use them, it is not waste. They are there for a purpose. So if you take the wrong interpretation of lean, just reduce inventories independently of what is the purpose of these inventories, or what these inventories have been placed there in the original decision, then we are not making lean. We are just streamlining without any justification on that. So I think lean is here to stay. It has provided a lot of advantages. We need to be smarter in its application.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, another question that we've received is that it's been said that now we have entered a new significant growth era of supply chain logistics. What are your thoughts on how this will manifest?
Sorry, what was your thoughts on?
What are your thoughts on, so I'll repeat it, don't worry. It's been said that we have now entered a new significant growth era of supply chain and logistics. What are your thoughts on how this will manifest?
Okay, well, again, we enter a new era, that's for sure, but still we don't know what this will bring with us. So One of the things that we learn in this during this crisis, especially as I mentioned, I've been doing work with hospitals. It's amazing how people in the hospitals, and I look at hospitals in Boston, in London, in Warsaw, in Barcelona, and you discover how the people reacted to solve the problems that the hospitals were having during the crisis in a very creative way. And the creative, the agile way that they have used to solve the problems are not very different from one place to another. Actually, the management in terms of crisis brings together the minds of many different people that are not brought together originally. So we go back to the question in the supply chains, the new era in the supply chains. One of the things of the new era in the supply chains is probably we need to understand our supply chains better. In every supply chain, imagine a supply chain for food. Okay, let's imagine tuna fish, cans of tuna fish. Okay, from the people who are fishing tuna in the ocean, all the way to the lady or a gentleman who buys the can of tuna in the supermarket. There are a lot of different players in the supply chain transforming and moving the tuna from one position to another. And this long chain, there is someone who has more powers than the others. In the chain for tuna fish, probably the supermarket chains are the ones who have the most of the power, because they can decide to have this brand or another brand of tuna fish. And I know that if the president of the tuna canning company and the president of Tesco have to have a meeting, it will be the president of Tesco who will decide when, where, and what dress code to use for that meeting. So that means this is the guy with the power. This is not always so. If we look at the automotive supply chain, the power here is not in the distributors. The power is in the OEMs, in the manufacturers. So different chains have evolved into different powerful players. And I think together with the power in the supply chain comes the responsibility. And it's much easier for the guys who have the power in the supply chain to open up the supply chain, to make it more transparent, to share data along the supply chain, because that helps everybody in the supply chain to perform better, to be able to play with less inventories everywhere and still be resilient. Some companies were well aware many years ago in the 70s already. Companies like Walmart started establishing practices by sharing data from the stores, from all the Walmart stores in the world, sharing data through satellites to their suppliers. So the suppliers knew how their products were selling in the different stores. So they knew whether more inventory was needed or the things were not selling well, and so they could reduce the inventory of this product and put more emphasis on the inventory of another product. This shared information helps the whole supply chain. It is not against each other, but somebody needs to manage, needs to foster this transparency. As I said, in every chain, there is this powerful guy, and this is the one who has the responsibility to make the chain transparent. Because at the end, the competition is not between one store and another store. It's between the supply chain that feeds the first store and supply chain that feeds the second store. Because everybody in the supply chain gets paid by the final customer who buys the product in the store. Everybody in the chain gets paid by this customer. So we all should aim at making life easier, getting the products to the market, lower the cost for this final customer.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, another question that we've had is, we've heard that managers blame, okay, actually no, sorry, I've missed that one. Okay, which do you think poses a bigger threat to supply chains and logistics, the coronavirus pandemic or Brexit? Maybe it's better to say supply chain and operations rather than, yeah.
Well, both of them are important disruptions. The difference, coronavirus is a global one. Okay, so coronavirus has hit all the countries in the world. The governments in different countries have reacted differently. It's still early to figure out which strategy was the best, both in dealing with the pandemic in terms of locking down or confining people very strictly or being a little bit softer on that. It's not yet clear what works and what not. It's not yet clear what was better in terms of increasing the capacity of existing hospitals or create some very large hospitals on the site of the existing ones to move the coronavirus patients there. We're still discussing on that. But the problem is that what started in China in January, it has been moving on and affected all the countries in the world. Brexit is going to be very important. It's going to be very important mainly for the European Union partners, which will be most impacted by both the products that are made in the UK from go to Europe and vice versa. But my feeling is it will be less than the coronavirus. If it is well managed, let's put it this way. Of course, we can all compete to make things worse.
Okay, thank you. Okay, just another question. Can you see a change of trend from outsourcing to insourcing? Or do you think that there'll become a point when we forget about the crisis and things will move back to the past situation?
There is a tendency to move back to the previous situation because that's the situation that we are all familiar with. We know how to manage in this situation. But as I said, what we need to figure out is what are the things that we believe we know, but they may no longer be true in the new situation. We need to identify those things. And some of the things we may want to identify in there may force us maybe not to insource in the sense of doing inside some of the things, but in terms of looking for alternative suppliers. I should insource the things that I believe I can be competitive in making. And for some things to be competitive in making, I probably need a very large volume. And if I'm only manufacturing for my own use, I will never be competitive. So what I need to look is for another supplier, for this China plus one supplier that I was mentioning, someone who is very good, who is quite efficient, who is doing it maybe within Europe. So I may look for suppliers within the European region, may look for suppliers in the eastern part where the prices or the costs are still lower than in the western part. We can try to look for suppliers in the north of Africa, which has developed quite well, the Turkey area, the Middle East. Of course, all of these dependent on the disruption that each one of these areas have on their own. Right? Remember, the pandemic has hit every country, but there are other areas that are hit by their own problems, and we need to be aware of that. Okay, so be aware where you put your eggs if you want to put them into baskets.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Okay, well, so just one last question then to round up. With regards to supply chain management, what would you say has been the number one lesson that companies can learn from this experience of the global pandemic?
Well, one of the things that work very well, I mentioned, is that we are, as humans, it's amazing what we are able to do when we put our tempers aside, our egos aside, and we look for the main cause. I've seen in companies that have been able to change to manufacture one product to manufacture another product that was in higher need. I've seen car manufacturers like GM or SEAT in Spain transforming their lines to manufacture hospital respirators and making them available to hospitals. I've seen within hospitals doctors that never talk to each other because each one of them wanted to be more important than the chief of service next door, to cooperate as if they were the best friends in the world. So crisis brings a lot of good things out of us. It also brings some improvements, things that we don't do usually, but that we're able to do in the crisis. We're able to do things faster. We are more flexible. Of course, in some of these things, we have not had all the intervention, the controlling part. They have allowed people to just solve the problem. I think we need to have some control, but be aware, don't go to the old system. Supply chains have been much more efficient now than they have been in the past. Things move faster. from one part to another. Why? Why are we able to do that during the crisis? Why we cannot keep these advantages also during normal times? Let's try to keep what the good things that the crisis has brought us.
Fair enough. I think that's fantastic advice to end on. Well, thank you so much, Professor Ribera, for sharing your insight with us. We have been recording this session, and it's been up on live on our YouTube channel, and the recording will be kept there. So for all of you who've joined us today, if you would like to share it with a colleague or contact of yours that you think they would find it interesting as well, please do feel free to do so. I will send around the link to that later this afternoon with a feedback survey, which it would be very helpful for us if you could fill in. So yeah, thank you very much, Professor Ribera, and yeah, have a lovely rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure to discuss with all of you.
Likewise. Bye-bye.
Bye.